There's no arguing that today's world is very complex and ever-changing. And this complexity and this ever-changing dynamic makes leadership of today's organizations very challenging because the sand is constantly shifting underneath us as we try to lead our organizations. And we get hit with different things and unexpected events and so on. So one of the characteristics of leadership that's being really put under the microscope right now is the concept of resilience. So there's a lot of talk about resilient leadership. So in this session, we're going to take a look at, first of all, what the concept of resilience is. So what do we mean when we say the word resilience? And then we'll take a look at how it specifically gets applied to leadership. We'll look at strategies and skills that you can add into your own leadership repertoire so that you can become a resilient leader. We'll start the session by defining the concept of resilience and the concept of a resilient leader. Then we'll take a look at the factors that contribute to resilient leadership. And we'll look at strategies that you can build up or that you can use in order to be a resilient leader yourself. We'll do a bit more of a dig down into two really important concepts when it comes to resilient leadership, and that is the concept of optimism and the concept of self-talk. So how do we talk to ourselves in situations of adversity? These both affect our resilience as a leader. Then we'll take a look at a resilient organization. So not just a leader, but the organization as a whole. Finally, you'll be given the opportunity to develop your own personal development plan in order to build your resiliency when it comes to leadership. And we'll wrap up the session with a quick look at some additional resources that you can look at. What is resilience? We can apply the word resilience to objects and we can apply it to people and organizations. So let's start with talking about resilience applied to objects. So a resilient object is one that can retake its original form when it's been changed due to stressors or pressures. So think of a stress ball, you know those squishy balls that we use to relieve stress? So if I have a stress ball in my hand and I squish it, it takes on a new shape as long as I'm squishing it, as long as the force of my hand is being applied to that stress ball. However, when I release my hand, then the ball takes its original shape again. So that's the ball's resilience. It retakes its original shape after being changed as a result of forces acting on it. Resilience applied to people and organizations is a tiny bit different. So we still have forces or stressors or some type of external pressure or internal pressure for that matter being exerted on the people or the organization. And what happens as a result of this pressure or these forces is that the people or the organizations change or adapt. So they are able to continue surviving despite these external forces that are being placed upon them. So any person or organization that's able to withstand changes coming at them from outside forces or even inside forces is called a resilient person or a resilient organization. We can get a better sense of the word resilience as it applies to people if we take a look at two sets of stressors that we as people are exposed to. So we have one set of stressors that are kind of continuous. These are small stressors that hit us a lot on a daily basis. So these might be stressors in our family relationships, in our jobs, in our finances, in our health, in our work environment. So these are just things that hit us all the time. So for example, if you've got a relationship and it's not perfect and you just have little things that are happening all the time, or in your environment, if you're in a very noisy environment or a chaotic environment, for example, these little stressors, they just hit you on a regular basis. So that's one set of stressors that individuals need to be resilient to. The other set of stressors are one-time big event stressors, and these are what we call catastrophic stressors. So these are huge events that really significantly impact our lives. So this can be anything from a death in the family, a divorce, a significant illness, or a significant accident that really impacts us. So that's the other set of stressors that individuals need to be resilient to. When you look at all of the stressors, both the small stressors and the catastrophic stressors, you can really start to understand the importance of resilience, because we as individuals, we have to be able to adapt to and change or recover from these events on a daily basis or at many different times during our lives. So you can see how resilience becomes really significant for us as individuals, and it becomes even more significant when we're in a leadership position. Before we move on to take a look at what a resilient leader is, there are 2 activities for you to try on your handout. The first one is just a quick online quiz that you can take that evaluates your own resilience. So it's just a series of questions, and then they give you a diagnosis at the end. Obviously take this with a grain of salt, but it's a really good place to start in terms of exploring your own resilience. The second activity just asks you to think about a series of questions about resilience in your own personal life. So it asks you to think about what are some personal stressors you've experienced, both daily stressors and then catastrophic stressors. How did you handle them? Were you as resilient as you wanted to be or as you had hoped to be? So try those activities out, and it'll help you process this concept of resilience. When I introduced the concept of resilience for people, remember that I indicated that it also applies to organizations or groups of people as well. So we can look at resilience at the individual level, but also at the group level when we put together more and more people into groups and look at how those groups function. So if we were to put this into a pyramid, right at the top of our resilience pyramid, we have individual resilience. But underneath that, there's a series of group resiliences, if you want to put it that way, that support that individual resilience. So we have an individual who has resilience, then we have an organization that has resilience. Within that and then underneath that, we have communities, groups of organizations that have resilience, and then we have whole societies that have resilience. So resilience doesn't just apply at the individual level, it applies at all of these groups of individuals of varying sizes and larger sizes. We can really have some fun with exploring these different types of group resilience and how that affects the individual resilience. If we have an individual who's really, really resilient, but that individual is functioning within an organization that is not resilient, that individual really has his or her work cut out for her, because that individual may be able to turn that organization around or may not be able to turn that organization around, depending upon how quickly that organization's resilience can be built up. It's also really interesting when we take a super big picture look and we look at the resilience of whole societies or countries. There are societies and countries in the world that simply are not resilient, and so they can't resist these daily stressors, and then if a catastrophic event happens within these societies just degenerate into complete chaos. And we've had examples of this over the years. If we look back in time to the catastrophic civil war that basically destroyed Somalia, that was as a result of and also created a society that really didn't have a lot of resilience in itself. It was so depleted that it simply could not withstand any of these stressors that came from the civil war. Another society that many researchers feel doesn't have a lot of resilience is Haiti, for example. Haiti experienced a catastrophic earthquake, and it's still trying to recover from that years later because the society as a whole didn't have a lot of resources within it in order to withstand such a catastrophic event. If you compare that to a society such as Japan, Japan also has experienced quite a number of catastrophic earthquakes, but because the society as a whole is much more resilient, it's been able to recover much more quickly from these equally catastrophic events. So it's really interesting when we start to play with this concept of resilience with these different groups, with companies, with communities, and with societies as a whole. Resilience is even more important when we look at individuals who are trying to lead these groups. So individuals leading organizations, or individuals leading communities, or individuals leading whole societies, so government leaders. Resilience is hugely, hugely important for these individuals in a leadership role, because these individuals as leaders are kind of walking around with a target on their back. Everyone likes to blame the leader. They're the most visible person of an organization or a community or a society. They're the easiest target when things go wrong. So our leaders are literally targeted on a daily basis with daily stressors within the organizations, and also they're the people who have to respond confidently and quickly when the organizations or communities or societies experience catastrophic stressors. So there is a lot of pressure on leaders to be resilient. I would argue that you cannot be a leader in today's organizations, communities, or societies without being resilient. What are some of the daily stressors that the leader of an organization has to be able to deal with? So daily stressors, remember, are just the small things. So if you've ever been a leader of an organization, you know that you have to deal with criticisms, complaints. You have to, from your employees, you have to deal with mistakes that your employees make on a daily basis, omissions, things that they forget to do. You have to deal with a lack of a lot of things. So you might not have enough money to run the organization the way you want. You might not have the right people. You might not have the right technology. So there's a lot of things you might be lacking that create daily stressors for you. So there's a lot going on a daily basis in an organization that puts stress or are a force for change on a leader. A leader may also have to deal with catastrophic stressors within the organization or from outside of the organization. So there may be catastrophic legal events going on, so errors or omissions that the organization has committed. There might be a catastrophic lawsuit that could destroy the organization. The organization could have engaged in criminal activities or could be the target of criminal activities. The organization could be subject to very significant environmental changes. The organization, a crucial one, may experience very significant financial losses. So there are a lot of catastrophic stressors that leaders also have to be resilient enough to deal with and to take their organizations through. There's just a quick activity on your handout for you to try, and this is a series of questions about you in a leadership role in the organization you are leading. So take a look at yourself in this leadership role in the organization. What were the daily stressors and adversities that you had to manage or withstand as a leader? And then were there any catastrophic or very significant stressors that you had to manage as a leader? And what was the outcome? How did you handle them? Would you have changed how you handled them? And did the organization come out the other end of these stressors? There are a lot of different factors that contribute to an individual's overall resilience. So we'll take a look at each of these factors in turn and just dig a little bit more deeply into them so that you can understand, first of all, the complexity that is resilience, and you can also understand different ways that you can start to look at your own resilience and analyze it and improve it or strengthen it. The first factor that contributes to individual resilience is age and experience. This is an interesting factor because it can kind of go both ways. So there's an argument that a younger age gives you more resilience. So if you're younger, you're possibly healthier, you're stronger, you have more energy, and so on. So that's the argument for being younger gives you more resilience. But then there's also a counter argument that being older gives you more resilience because you've got something called experience. So you've been through a lot in your life already, you know you can survive different things, and you can tap into past experience in order to get you through both daily stressors and catastrophic events. So age kind of can work in our favor depending on whether we're younger or older, but for different reasons. But it's definitely a factor in resilience. Another factor in individual resilience is context. And by this we mean, is it happening in your personal life or in your professional life? So in our personal lives, we may have a lot of resilience because we've got a good support system, we've got a strong family, we've got really good friendships and so on. So we've got a lot of resilience within the context of our personal life, but it may be a completely different story in our professional life. So maybe we're going through a job loss, or our job is being outsourced somewhere, or we find we don't have the skills we need in order to advance in our profession. So maybe we don't have a lot of resilience in our professional life. So looking at personal context versus professional context is another factor. So we may have people who have a lot of resilience in a personal context but not a professional context, and vice versa. People have a lot of resilience professionally but not so much resilience personally. So that context, personal versus professional, is another factor. I'll group the next three sets of factors together when it comes to individual resilience. So the first of these is health or physical factors. So it's pretty intuitive to say that someone who is healthier will generally have more resilience than someone who is not as healthy. So any type of illness can decrease our individual resilience, and vice versa. Being healthy increases our individual resilience. Then there's also emotional and psychological factors. So if we are emotionally healthy, then that gives us a lot of resilience. And if we are emotionally not healthy, that decreases our resilience. And then the final set of factors in this group of three is mental or intellectual resilience. So if we are mentally sharp and just have a lot of mental faculty or intellectual faculty, this does tend to make us more resilient. Or contributes to resilience. Whereas if our intellectual capacity is decreased for some reason, then that decreases our resilience. So these three sets of factors all contribute to individual resilience. Our social support system is a huge factor in individual resilience. So if we've got a network of people around us, be it in our professional lives or our personal lives, that network does contribute to our resilience. We've got people we can go to as a sounding board. We can get advice from them, we can brainstorm ideas with them, or we can just hang out with them and make life feel better by hanging out with our friends. So having a support network is a factor that contributes to resilience. There's a bit of a caveat here though. People who tend to be more introverted and reserved don't need as big of a support system, a social support system, as people who are extroverted. So if you're an introvert and you only have 3 or 4 people in your social support system, that's totally fine because that's all you need. Whereas if you're an extrovert, you probably have a much larger social support network or social support system because that's where you get your energy and that's what you need. But regardless of whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, that social support system is a factor in your resilience. And finally, financial resources do contribute to individual resilience. We don't like to say that money equals happiness, but the research is really interesting on this one. The research says that we need a certain amount of money, up to a certain point, in order to be happy. And this ties in with resilience. If we've got enough financial resources to draw upon, to be financially stable and secure, so we know where our mortgage payment or our rent payment's coming from, we know that we can put food on the table every day, we've got clothes to clothe ourselves with, and maybe a little bit of extra for enjoyment in our lives. If we've got that minimum amount of financial resources, then we can be resilient. It's when we go below that amount that the lack of resilience comes in, because if we don't have the financial resources, either daily stressors or a catastrophic event will wipe out our whatever finances we rely upon for our daily existence. So all of this interesting research on happiness and money plays into the idea of resilience, because we need a certain amount of money in order to be happy, because that money gives us the resilience and gives us financial resources. When we go above that, it actually doesn't increase our happiness because we don't need it. It's not a foundation for our resilience and a foundation for our happiness. So this research on happiness and money comes into the concept of resilience in a really interesting way. So money is important because it gives us resilience. Too much money or more than that minimum that we need doesn't affect us either way. There's an activity on your handout that just asks you to think about your own resilience. So take a look at yourself and your life and take a look at each of these individual factors that contribute to your resilience. Which factors are stronger in your life? Which factors are weaker in your life? Which factors might you want to work on in order to increase your individual resilience? We're going to to take a look at different strategies or frameworks that we can use in order to work on our own individual resilience. So each of these strategies or frameworks allows us to look at resilience in a slightly different way, and this allows us to work on our own resilience in a slightly different way as well. So the first framework we're going to look at is a very simple equation. And this framework this equation says that we have random events, basically fate. So these are just the things that happen to us that we can't control. And then we add together individual choice, and that then gives us resilience. And so we can't control these random events. We can't control what happens to us. Events happen to us whether we try and protect ourselves from them or not. Things are just going to happen. These are the random events. So we can't control that. But we do have this individual choice piece in the equation. And so we can choose how we respond to these random events. And it is in that individual choice that we get our own resilience. So I have a random event happen to me, and I can choose to view it positively, I can choose to view it negatively, I can choose to make it a learning event, I can choose to allow it to be an event that takes me under. So that individual choice in this equation is crucial to me having resilience. So that's our first framework. Random events plus individual choice equals resilience. The area that we can control is that individual choice. The next framework is another equation. This equation has three components and then the equals side. So the first component that leads to resilience is what we call task orientation. The second one is called self-efficacy, and the third one is called access to resources. When you put these three pieces together, that's how you get resilience. So let's take a look at each of these three in turn. Task orientation is an individual choice we make about what we're going to focus on. So are we going to focus on the task or the job at hand, or are we going to focus on other things, for example, our emotional reaction to the situation? Here's an example. Let's say I'm walking along, it's winter, and I slip on some ice and I break my ankle. So my task then, once I've obviously been to the hospital and had my ankle seen to, my task is to rehabilitate my ankle. I need to get my ankle well, get it strong, make sure the muscles stay strong, and just make sure I do everything possible to get my ankle healed. So that would be my task orientation. I'm just going to focus on the fact that I need to get this ankle healed, I need to work on the muscles, I need to rehabilitate it. If I'm not task oriented, might just be focusing on the emotional side of things. So oh my goodness, I can't go to work, or I'm restricted in this way, and you know what, it's just before Christmas, this is going to ruin my Christmas, and I can't believe this horrible event happened to me, and I'm going to find someone to sue. So these are all the things that stop me from focusing on the task of getting my ankle better. Which one's going to make me more resilient? Focusing on the task of getting my ankle better, or making my ankle better. So that's task orientation. What's the job that needs doing, and just focus on doing the job. The next component in this equation is self-efficacy. This is a really hard word to say. Don't try and say it many times quickly. Self-efficacy is all about the belief we have, or an individual has, about his or her ability to overcome a situation. So if I have a high level of self-efficacy, I can look at a situation and I can very confidently believe that, you know what, I can handle this. This is not a problem. So that's self-efficacy. If I don't have self-efficacy, I can look at a problem or a situation and I can have no confidence or no self-belief that I can handle this situation. So instead I look at the situation with fear, with stress. I just want to hide from it because I don't believe that I can deal with this situation. So that's low self-efficacy. Obviously, in order to have resilience, we need to have high self-efficacy. We need to look at a situation and believe that we can manage it. This situation is not a problem. I can handle this. That gives me resilience. The final component of this equation is access to resources. And by resources, I don't just mean money. So if I'm in a situation, I need to access a lot of different things in order to get through that situation. So going back to the broken ankle situation, I need to access healthcare resources. I need to access people in my life who can support me, maybe drive me to the hospital or drive me to doctor's appointments. Maybe I need access to a taxi service or to the money for a taxi service. Maybe I need access to someone to help me in my house until I get on my feet again. So access to resources means that I can tap into a lot of different people resources, organizational resources, financial resources, maybe technology resources, in order to help get me through a particular situation. So that's the third piece in this equation of resilience. So this three-component equation, here's just a quick review of it. Task orientation plus self-efficacy plus access to resources equals resilience. This is a great framework because it gives us these three pieces to focus on in order to build up our own resilience. So task orientation, we get ourselves focusing on the task. Self-efficacy, we look at a situation and we believe we can manage it. And then access to resources, we look at what we've got around us and we tap into those resources in order to manage a situation. So it's a very simple equation, but it's a very powerful one in order to allow us to be as resilient as possible in different situations. The final framework that we'll look at is a set of 9 characteristics that researchers have identified as being really important in resilience. So each of these 9 characteristics contributes to an individual's resilience. And in identifying these 9 characteristics, the researchers identified individuals who had survived really challenging personal circumstances or situations in their lives. And they interviewed them to identify different characteristics that allowed those individuals to survive those experiences. Some of the experiences that these individuals had survived and overcome included being a prisoner of war for many, many years. I think one of the individuals had been a prisoner of war for up to 8 years. Individuals who had survived very challenging health situations. So one of the individuals had been born with very restrictive physical movement, but she had managed to build a really successful and thriving life for herself. Other individuals were those who had overcome very serious family circumstances and become successful. So the researchers very strategically identified success stories when it came to resilience, and they did in-depth interviews with these individuals to pull out these 9 characteristics. The first characteristic that came up over and over again in these interviews was optimism. So all of the individuals interviewed were optimistic. They always believed that there was a positive outcome coming at the end of their situation. They never lost hope, or if they lost hope, it was only for a very short amount of time. They always believed that things would be good or things would get better. We'll talk a bit more about optimism later because it is so crucial to resilience. The next characteristic identified was facing fears. So these individuals they interviewed, they faced their fears head on. So they didn't hide from their situations, they didn't delude themselves about their situations. They identified what they were afraid of and they faced it right on. They did not hide from those fears, they went right into it. One of the individuals they interviewed, I remember, was someone going into battle, literally. And this individual just put fear aside, relied on his training, and just went into battle. So facing our fears, that's crucial to resilience. The next characteristic is a bit of an interesting one, and this is developing and using a moral compass. So this has nothing to do with religion. This is simply these resilient individuals, they had a very clear idea in their own minds about what was right and what was wrong, and they attempted at every moment of every day to do what was right. So they very clearly had in their own mind what the right course of action was in any given situation, and they stood by it. They said, this is the right thing to do, and this is what I'm going to do. No matter how hard it got, they did the right thing according to their own moral compass. So once again, this has nothing to do with religion. It is simply having a very strong belief in your own mind about what is right and what is wrong. What's the right action? What's the wrong action? The fourth component we've already talked about because it does come into our other models, and that's building a strong social support network. So I won't say any more about that, except you need to have a strong support network around you in order to be resilient. So I'll go on to the next one as well. The next characteristic was these individuals had what they called resilient role models. So as they were facing their daily stressors or their catastrophic events, they always had in mind an individual who they were trying to emulate. So they looked at that individual and they thought, well, what would that individual do? And okay, that individual did this, and look at the good outcome that that person had. So throughout their lives, they had resilient role models that they went to either in person or just in their own minds to as guides for what they should do in certain situations. So having resilient role models is important. The next two factors we've already seen. These are no surprise. These are staying physically fit and staying mentally fit. There were some really interesting stories that came out of the researcher interviews with individuals who had been prisoners of war. These individuals in horrific and very confining situations had done everything possible in order to stay physically fit. So no matter how bad the food was, they made themselves eat it. They made themselves exercise every day. They set themselves targets for the number of push-ups or sit-ups or whatever movement they could do in their confined spaces. So they did everything possible to stay physically fit. They also did everything possible to stay mentally fit. They gave themselves memorization activities. The prisoners of war, they would share passages of books that they had memorized, and they would practice repeating these over and over again, just lots of memory games in order to stay mentally fit as well. So obviously, most of us, fortunately, do not have to face a horrific situation of being a prisoner of war, but staying mentally fit and staying physically fit is something we need to work on every single day. The next characteristic identified is to be emotionally and cognitively flexible and adaptable. So this kind of sounds like it might go against having a moral compass, but it doesn't really. In order to be flexible emotionally and cognitively, you need to just allow for the fact that there are other ways of doing things and that there's no one perfect way for something to happen. Another way to put this one is to just let go of perfectionism. You will never be perfect. The things you do will never be perfect. A situation will never be perfect. What you have to do is be realistic and work with what you are, work with the situation you're in, and flexibly figure out a way to negotiate or navigate this situation. So if you're a perfectionist, let it go, because perfectionism gets in the way of resilience. You have to be mentally and emotionally flexible. The final characteristic in this model or framework of resilience is finding the meaning or purpose behind events or actions. So the individuals interviewed for this particular framework, they always dug to find the meaning and a purpose. So what's the meaning of an event? What's the purpose of what they're doing? They always had a reason for doing things, and they always found a reason to do things. So find the meaning, find the purpose. This gives you resilience. Take a look at these three frameworks for building resilience, or these three sets of strategies for resilience, and reflect on your own experiences when it comes to resilience. So which of these strategies or equations or frameworks have you used in the past in order to build up your own resilience? Which frameworks might you want to apply in the future in order to become more resilient? So apply these three frameworks to your own situation right now and use them to analyze your own resilience. If you recall from the final framework that we looked at, the one that resulted from interviews with individuals who had overcome very, very challenging situations in their lives, remember right off the top, the first characteristic in this framework was optimism. We're going to take a deeper look at optimism because optimism is crucial when it comes to having resilience. You cannot be resilient without optimism. So let's take a look at it. Let's first define optimism versus its opposite, pessimism. So optimism is the belief that the future will be good. So you have a belief or a hope that at some point the future is going to turn in your favor and it's going to be a good future. The opposite of that is pessimism. Pessimism is a negative outlook on the future. So you don't believe that the future will be good. You look at all of the evidence around you and you think and you conclude, no, it is not a good future. This is pessimism. So optimism, the future is bright. Pessimism, the future is not so bright. A lot of people who are pessimistic think, well, I'm not pessimistic, I'm actually realistic. I'm not going to delude myself and believe that the future will be good when in fact all the evidence tells me it won't be good. But pessimism is actually more than that. Pessimism is not realism. It is possible to be realistic and be optimistic at the same time. So that's what we're going to take a look at. We're going to move towards this concept of realistic optimism. But before that, we'll define a few other types of optimism. The first type of optimism is called dispositional or trait optimism. These are people who are just naturally optimistic. They always see the good side of things. They always see the bright side. They always see the silver lining in the cloud. So dispositional optimism affects every aspect of these individuals' lives. They just think everything is good in all aspects of their lives. So dispositional optimism is just a characteristic that some people inherently seem to have. Situational optimism, on the other hand, is just a belief or a hope about one specific aspect of our lives or of an individual's life. So dispositional optimism covers all aspects of life, whereas situational optimism relates just to one particular situation. So I've got lots of different situations going on in my life, but I've identified one in particular that I have hope for. Then in this situation, I believe the future will be good. So that's situational optimism. Blind optimism is a type of optimism that we really don't want to have. And it's a type of optimism that older people often accuse younger people of having. So blind optimism is simply the belief that things will be good regardless of what I do. And people who are blindly optimistic, they simply don't evaluate risk very well. So these are the people who, these are the kids or the teens who might, they're out skateboarding and they decide to grab the back of a car and go along for a ride on the back of this car on their skateboard. That person has completely blocked off any idea of risk in his or her mind, and so this person is blindly optimistic that this will be a good experience. Whereas someone else looking at that experience will evaluate the risk and say, you know what, it's risky here, here, and here, probably not a good thing to be doing, so you don't want to do it. So blind optimism is an optimism that allows us to shut out all of the risk, all of the bad things that could possibly happen, and we just believe there's going to be a good outcome with this. So you can see how blind optimism might not be so good because it leads us to putting ourselves in very high-risk situations without having evaluated those risks. So blind optimism is not really something you want to go towards. Realistic optimism is the kind of optimism that gives us resilience. Realistic optimism is when we realistically, I'm going to say that word realistic many times, we realistically evaluate the situation we're in. We identify the variables that we can control and the variables that we can't control, and we still believe we can get through that situation. And we believe that we can do this by focusing on the variables we can control and letting go of the variables we can't control. So this is realistic optimism. We take a very realistic look at our situation, identify what we can control, what we can't, and we focus our efforts on what we can control, and we believe we can make things better by focusing our efforts there. Realistic optimism gives us resilience. Remember dispositional optimism, the optimism that someone just seems to have inherently, it's almost part of their DNA. Well, if we don't have dispositional optimism, it's not something we were born with and it's not an inherent part of us, we have to get what's called learned optimism. So we have to very consciously teach ourselves to be optimistic. We have to teach ourselves to be realistically optimistic. We have to teach ourselves to look for the things in a situation we can control. We have to teach ourselves to focus on the silver lining that goes with the cloud, so to speak. So if we are not inherently optimistic as part of our DNA, we have to work on what's called learned optimism. We have to consciously become optimistic. The opposite of learned optimism is learned helplessness. This is where instead of looking at a situation and identifying what we can control and what we can't and focusing on what we can control, we do the opposite. We just very fatalistically say, you know what, I can't do anything about this situation, it's just bad, nothing I do makes any difference, I can't change anything. It's sounding very depressing here, isn't it? So learned helplessness is something we don't want to get into because it leads to us not having resilience. We want learned optimism, not learned helplessness. Take a look at your own experience with optimism. So in different situations, particularly as a leader, have you used optimism to your advantage? When were you optimistic? When were you not? Do you use learned optimism? Do you sometimes find yourselves in a position of learned helplessness? Take all of these concepts and apply them to situations you've experienced in your life, particularly situations in which you've been a leader. One strategy for developing resilience is to really understand how we explain events to ourselves and how we explain consequences or outcomes to ourselves. Because if we can explain outcomes and consequences in a positive way, then that actually helps us with our resilience. So for example, if we take the equation adversity plus beliefs equals consequences, if we manipulate that beliefs piece of the equation, we can actually get a significantly different set of consequences. So for example, if I change my belief about this adversity, then I can actually change the consequences that I get, particularly at the emotional level. So for example, something bad happens to me, and if I have the belief that this is fated and there's nothing I can do to change this, that bad thing that happened to me is probably going to have some pretty adverse consequences for me. But if something bad happens to me and then I look at it and I figure out, okay, this is the part I can control and this is the part I can't control, so I'm going to focus on what I can control, that can actually change my outcomes. So changing our beliefs about the things that happen to us changes the consequences of those adverse events for us. So this is one way that we can develop resilience in terms of how we explain things to ourselves. We can manipulate that beliefs part of the equation to get more positive consequences or outcomes for ourselves. I'd just like you to take a few minutes to try applying this to an event that you've experienced. So think about an event you experienced recently, and it was think about an adverse event, and think about what you believed at the time about that event and about your ability to manage that event and about what the outcomes would be. So did you have a positive belief about your ability to manage that event? Did you have a negative set of beliefs about your ability to manage that event? How were you thinking as that event unfolded? Then the second thing I'd like you to do is imagine you had actually changed how you believed about that situation or what you believed about that situation. So the adversity remained the same, but imagine that set of beliefs was different. Would you have gotten different outcomes? One piece that we can pull out of this beliefs piece of this equation is how we actually talk to ourselves as adverse events are unfolding, or as positive events are unfolding as well. This is called our explanatory style. So our explanatory style is the internal conversation we have with ourselves as events are unfolding. And if we have a positive explanatory style, so we're very optimistic about our ability to handle the situation and we're optimistic about the outcomes, this increases our optimism and it increases our resilience. And of course, the opposite is true. If our explanatory style is very negative, if we come down really hard on ourselves, we call ourselves an idiot and we're incapable of doing this, and why are you in this situation, and this is impossible, you'll never get out of it, that creates a pessimism in ourselves, obviously, and it obviously decreases our resilience. So explanatory style is really, really important both for increasing our optimism and for increasing our resilience. How we talk to ourselves, how that internal conversation unfolds, is really significant in building our resilience. There are three factors that contribute to our overall explanatory style, or how we explain things to ourselves in an internal conversation. These are the three P's, so they are permanence, personalization, and pervasiveness. So we'll take a look at each of these in turn so you can get a better understanding of these three factors that influence your explanatory style. The first P is permanence, and there's kind of two ways that we can take this with our explanatory style. The first way is that we can believe an event is permanent, so it's never going to change, nothing I do will ever change this situation, this is it. And then the opposite of that is we consider this event to be temporary. So you know what, this is just temporary, there's a light at the end of the tunnel there somewhere, maybe I can't see it right now, but it is there. So looking at this idea of permanent versus temporary when we evaluate an event, what do you think contributes to resilience and optimism? Well, you've got it. If we believe an event is permanent and nothing we do can change it, then we're not going to have a lot of optimism, and we certainly won't have a lot of resilience. If, however, we believe that this adverse situation we're in is temporary, and we believe that, yes, somewhere out there, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, then we're going to be more optimistic and we're going to have more resilience. So the first P, permanence, it looks at events as either being permanent or temporary. The next P is personalization. And personalization can be once again divided into two pieces. So there is an external personalization and an internal personalization. So if I think something is external, then I believe it's not my fault. Whatever bad thing has happened, I'm not responsible for it. It's someone else's fault. If I take an internal personalization, then I believe that this adverse event is my fault. Everything's my fault. Everything stops with me. It's totally my fault. That's an internal personalization. So an internal personalization takes all responsibility on, we take all responsibility on ourselves. With an external personalization, we take no responsibility on ourselves. This one's a bit of an interesting factor because obviously if we take everything on ourselves and we take an internal personalization perspective, then we're actually not going to be very optimistic and we won't have a lot of resilience because everything is our fault and everything we do creates problems, and we kind of can get very dramatic about, oh, this is all my fault, and so on. So that can decrease our resilience. But the opposite is actually also equally problematic. If I just say, you know what, this is not my fault, nothing's my fault, then I'm not facing reality because maybe I did actually do something to create this adverse situation or to make it worse or something like that. So in terms of having optimism and resilience, you don't want to actually be on either the fully internal side of personalization or the fully external side of personalization. You want to just be realistic, right in the middle. Very realistically assess what was my fault and what was not my fault. What did I have control over and what did I not have control over? So this is not as clear-cut as the other factor. Internal personalization versus external, you actually want to sit somewhere in the middle. The final P is pervasiveness. Pervasiveness is all about how much of your life you feel this particular adverse event affects. So a universal perspective on pervasiveness means everything in your life is bad. So even though you just have one small event, it's just a reflection of everything that's bad in your life. So you have a universally bad life. Then the other perspective is very situation perspective. You believe that, you know what, it's just this one piece of my life that's not working. I've got adversity just in this one piece, but you know what, if I look around at everything else, things are going pretty good. So we've got universal versus situation specific. Which one gives us more optimism and more resilience? You guessed it, the situation-specific pervasiveness perspective. So if I believe, you know what, this bad event, it's just one small piece of my life, I'm going to be more optimistic and I'm going to have more resilience. If I believe that, oh, my entire life is a disaster and everything's wrong and I've just got a universally bad situation, then I'm not going to have as much optimism, or I'm not going to have any at all, and I'm not going to have resilience. I'd like you to take a few minutes to apply this particular framework to an adverse event that you went through recently. So think about the event and think about the explanatory style that you used with yourself. What internal conversation did you have with yourself as you were going through this adverse event? And analyze it according to the 3 Ps. So did you think it was permanent versus temporary? How did you personalize this? So did you internalize it or externalize it? And then what degree of pervasiveness did you assign to this particular event? So take a look at it, analyze it by the 3 Ps so you can understand what your explanatory style was as you went through this particular event. Then as the next step, I'd like you to analyze again and kind of speculate if you had changed your explanatory style. So if you had switched from a from a permanent to a temporary perspective on it, for example, how would that actually have changed the outcome? How would that have changed your perspective on this particular event, and how would it have changed your explanatory style. So do some analysis with a recent event, applying the 3 Ps. Back at the beginning of this session, we talked about resilience not just residing at the individual level, but also at the group level. So we looked at individual resilience, we looked at organizational resilience, we looked at community resilience, and then societal resilience. We're going to take another quick look at that organizational resilience level, because when you're working with an organization in a leadership role, it's really important to understand not just your own personal resilience, but also the resilience of the organization as a whole. Because it doesn't matter, you could be the most resilient leader around, you could be the most brilliant leader around, but if your organization itself isn't resilient, it doesn't matter what you do, that organization is not going to get through adverse events. So resilience is not important just for you as a leader, it is really important for your entire organization. So let's just take a quick look at what organizational resilience looks like. So this diagram gives you an idea of some of the factors that go into organizational resilience. So the first factor is access to people resources. So do you actually have good people in your organization? Are they committed to your organization? Do they have the skills they need? Are they just good, solid people with their own level of resilience? The next factor is financial resources. So does your organization have the financial resources it needs in order to push through adverse events? Or is an adverse event going to push your organization to a crisis level in terms of finances? Another factor in organizational resilience really is the work environment. So do you have a positive work environment? Do people want to come to work? Do they enjoy coming to work? Do they bring a lot of optimism to work themselves? And is it a rewarding work environment for people to be in? So do your staff in your organization want to be there? Then there are 3 factors that talk about the access to resources that you have. So do you have access at an organizational level to the knowledge and skills that you need? Do you have access to the technology that you need? And do you actually have access to a market in order to sell your services or products, or offer your services or products in order to survive and make money, bring revenue in, and so on? So do you have access to what you need in order to function effectively as an organization? If you suspect that your organization is not resilient, use this diagram to start analyzing what's going on and identifying factors or areas that you can change within your organization in order to build up your organization's resilience. So take a look at the people factors, the work environment factors, the finance factors, and so on, and help your organization become much more resilient. So I'm going to put you to work doing just that. Take a look at the organization that you're currently a part of or currently leading. Analyze it according to all of the factors presented in this diagram, and indicate or identify different areas that you can focus on as a leader in order to build up your organization's resilience. So apply this particular diagram or framework to your organization. Now it's time for you to look back over everything that I've presented in this session about being a resilient leader, and it's time to identify different areas that you personally want to focus on. So make your personal plan of action or your personal action plan. So identify at least 3 areas that you want to focus on. Don't go more than 4 or 5, but at least 3 in the next 4 months in order to build up your resilience as a leader. So what particular framework spoke to you, which particular area or information can you really apply to your situation, and how can you do that in the next 4 months? So create 3 SMART goals for yourself with respect to becoming or being a resilient leader over the next 4 months. your handout, I've given you some of the resources that I used in developing this session. So if you want to delve more deeply into this concept of resilient leader or how to be a resilient leader, these are really good go-to resources. They're all available from the major booksellers. Take a look at them, do more research and more work on becoming or being a resilient leader. Here's a quick recap of what we covered in this session. First of all, we defined the concept resilience, and then we looked at what a resilient leader is. We examined factors that contribute to resilience, and then we looked at specific strategies or frameworks that we can use for building our own resilience. We narrowed in on two very specific strategies, that strategy of optimism and the strategy of explanatory style. Then we took a look at what it means to be a resilient organization. So not just a resilient leader, but how do we make our organizations resilient as well. I gave you the opportunity to develop a personal plan of action, and I pointed you towards your handout for additional resources. Thanks very much for sitting in on this session, and hopefully you got some good information and some good ideas to become or continue being a resilient leader.